I realized something was wrong in the middle of a sentence she didn't finish, the kind of sentence couples trail off all the time without consequence, except this one hung in the air between us like a held breath that never came back, her eyes flicking to her phone with a reflex that was too fast and too practiced to be innocent. And in that moment, I understood that whatever was happening in our marriage had already happened somewhere else first, without me, without a discussion, without even the decency of being afraid of losing me. It wasn't one thing, and that's what made it unbearable, because one thing can be denied or forgiven or argued into something smaller. But this was a constellation of tiny shifts that only make sense once you're standing in the dark long enough to let your eyes adjust, the way she started showering the second she came home. Even on days she used to complain she was exhausted, the way her laughter changed tone when she texted, lighter and private, like she was careful not to let the sound reach me. The way intimacy with me became scheduled and polite while everything else about her seemed restless and charged, like energy had simply been redirected instead of lost. I told myself stories at first because that's what you do when you love someone and don't want to be the kind of person who assumes the worst without proof. Stories about stress and work and age and phases people go through when they're trying to remember who they are. But the stories kept collapsing under the weight of details that didn't belong to them, like the way she started protecting her phone with her body instead of a passcode, angling the screen away as if I'd suddenly become a stranger who might steal from her, or the way she'd mention the same name casually and then go quiet right after, as if she'd said too much and needed to see whether I noticed the slip. What hurt most was the distance that felt rehearsed rather than organic, the emotional restraint that didn't come from conflict or exhaustion, but from intention, like she was conserving something she no longer wanted to spend on me, and I could feel it in the way conversations ended early, in the way her apologies came too quickly and meant too little, in the way she'd touch me absently and then pull back as if remembering a rule she'd set for herself somewhere I wasn't allowed to see. There was still attraction between us, and that was the cruelest part, because desire doesn't disappear just because loyalty does. And sometimes she'd catch my eye with a look that reminded me of who we used to be, a look that promised closeness and heat and shared history, only to turn away seconds later with a smile that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely, leaving me suspended between wanting her and realizing that wanting her no longer meant the same thing to both of us. I started paying attention not because I wanted confirmation, but because my body already knew something my mind was trying to outrun, the tightness in my chest every time she was late, the way silence stretched when I asked simple questions, the way my own voice sounded careful around her, as if I'd already accepted that I was negotiating for space in a life that used to be ours without terms. The unfairness of it settled in slowly, heavy and cold, because she hadn't asked for a change or admitted to doubt or even fought with me enough to justify the distance. She'd simply made a decision and expected me to live inside the consequences without explanation, and as I lay awake listening to her breathe beside me, close enough to touch and farther away than she'd ever been, I understood that whatever truth was waiting for me wasn't going to arrive in a dramatic confession or a careless mistake. It was going to reveal itself quietly, piece by piece, until I either looked directly at it or disappeared inside the denial with her. The proof didn't arrive like a thunderclap, and that was almost worse, because it came in polite little pieces that would have sounded ridiculous if I'd said them out loud, the kind of details you could explain away with a shrug if you weren't the one living inside them. And the first piece was a dry cleaning ticket crumpled in the side pocket of her work tote, dated for a day she told me she barely left the office, except the address on the ticket wasn't anywhere near her office, and the pickup time was stamped at an hour she'd supposedly been stuck in a meeting with her boss. I stood in our kitchen holding that slip of paper like it could burn me through my skin, listening to the dishwasher hum, feeling my heart thump with that slow, nauseating rhythm of someone realizing their reality has been edited. And then I did the thing I never thought I'd do in my own marriage, which was put it back exactly where I found it, because I wasn't ready to give her the satisfaction of watching me flinch. After that, I stopped asking questions that would invite a performance, and I started collecting the quiet stuff that didn't care about her story, like the mileage in her car that jumped in neat chunks on days she claimed she went straight home, like the way our streaming account suddenly had continue watching for shows I'd never seen and wouldn't choose, shows that played when I was at work and she was too tired to even look at a screen. like the restaurant charge that hit our shared card for a place she'd made fun of months ago because it was too pretentious for people who want to look interesting. And I remember staring at that charge and thinking how intimate it was that she'd taken him somewhere she once described to me with a wrinkled nose, because that meant she was curating a version of herself for him that didn't even have room for the honest opinions she used to share with me. I didn't go digging through her phone like some paranoid cliché, because I knew the moment I did that, I'd turn into the kind of man she could point at later and say, with righteous disgust, that I drove her away. And instead, I waited for life to hand me what it always hands you when someone gets sloppy, which was the night she fell asleep on the couch with her phone face down on her chest, the screen lighting up every few minutes with a name that wasn't saved as a name at all, just an initial and a little emoji that made my jaw tighten, and I watched it appear again and again like a metronome of disrespect, while her breathing stayed soft and unconcerned. I didn't touch the phone, and I didn't need to, because the way her lips parted when the screen lit up told me everything about the comfort she felt receiving him, and the smell on her skin told me everything about the closeness she'd been offering somewhere else before coming home and letting me kiss her forehead like a dutiful roommate. The moment I understood I couldn't confront her wasn't dramatic either, and it came when she walked into the kitchen the next morning wearing that calm, almost cheerful expression she'd been practicing lately, pouring coffee like we were normal, leaning against the counter in that way that used to make my attention snap to her without permission, and for a second the attraction punched through the pain so hard I hated myself for still wanting her, because she looked good in a way that felt intentional, hair just messy enough to look effortless, skin bright like she'd slept deeply, and I realized she hadn't slept deeply beside me in weeks. She caught me looking and smiled with an intimacy that felt rehearsed, then reached out and traced the edge of my wrist with her fingertips like she was checking that I was still tethered, and I heard myself say carefully, "You seem happier lately, and I keep wondering what changed." And she didn't even miss a beat, her voice warm and airy as she answered, "Nothing changed, and I'm just trying to be better about work-life balance because you know how I get when I'm stressed, and I love you, so stop looking at me like I'm a suspect." I let the silence stretch just long enough to feel her tension twitch under the surface, and then I gave her the easiest exit in the world, because I needed her comfortable, I needed her careless, I needed her to keep believing I was the same predictable man who would argue, plead, demand honesty, and I said, "I'm not accusing you of anything, and I just miss you, because I feel like you've been somewhere else even when you're right here." She stepped closer, pressed her body lightly against mine in a way that would have made me melt a year ago, and she whispered, "You're imagining it, and I'm right here, and you're the only one I come home to." And the words were tender enough to almost pass as love, except the phrasing landed like a technicality, like she'd chosen it because it was defensible, and I nodded into her hair while something inside me went perfectly still. That was when the plan began without me calling it a plan, because I knew if I confronted her I'd get tears, denial, maybe anger, and then a rewritten version of events where I'd be the one on trial, and I wasn't going to hand her that stage. Silence wasn't weakness anymore, and it was strategy, because the longer I acted normal, the more she relaxed into her lie, and the more the truth kept leaking out through receipts, timestamps, small slips of language, and that one little initial that kept flashing on her screen like a private joke at my expense. I didn't want a messy fight that ended with her walking away feeling powerful and justified, and I wanted something cleaner than that, something that didn't rely on her admitting anything, something that would hurt her in the exact place she thought she was safe. And as I rinsed my mug and watched her walk out the door with a quick kiss that felt like a stamp of ownership rather than affection, I decided I would let her believe I didn't know right up until the moment knowing became unavoidable. I learned his name the way you learn most truths you weren't supposed to know, through something so boring and unguarded it almost felt insulting, because it came from a shared calendar reminder she forgot to delete, a bland entry labeled Lunch M, sitting there in the middle of a workday she'd told me was wall-to-wall meetings, and I stared at that single letter long enough to feel my pulse in my ears, because initials are intimate in a way full names aren't, a shorthand reserved for people you assume no one else will ever see. I didn't rush to uncover him, and that patience surprised me, because the anger was there, dense and heavy, but it was wrapped in a colder curiosity that wanted to understand the shape of the thing that had been quietly rearranging my life. So I waited until the world handed me more context, which it did a few days later when she mentioned him out loud by accident, his name slipping into a sentence about office politics before she could catch it, her voice hitching just slightly as she corrected herself and pretended nothing had happened. Once I had the name, the rest came disturbingly easy, not because I'm clever, but because people who believe they're invisible stop checking their reflections, and within an hour I knew where he worked, what he looked like, the awards he'd posted on professional pages, the articles written about him that painted him as dependable and principled, a man who smiled with his whole face and shook hands like he meant it. And what unsettled me wasn't that he was impressive, but that he was ordinary in the most dangerous way, stable and respected and wrapped in a life that looked nothing like a secret. I found his wife by accident while scrolling through a local charity site, her name listed under a board photo that showed her laughing openly at the camera, posture relaxed, eyes direct, the kind of woman people assume is either very loved or very strong, sometimes both. And I sat there longer than I meant to, studying the curve of her smile, the confidence in the way she stood, feeling something in my chest shift as I realized she wasn't a ghost in his story, but a central figure, someone with history and weight, and a presence that contradicted the idea that he'd risk everything for something shallow. That was when my focus changed, almost without my consent, because the man stopped being interesting the moment I understood that his betrayal, like my wife's, was made possible by someone else absorbing the cost without knowing it. And I started thinking about the wife in quiet, intrusive ways, wondering what she believed her life to be, whether she felt that same rehearsed distance at home, whether she told herself the same stories I had, whether she noticed the same small changes and dismissed them, because trusting someone you've built a life with feels like a moral obligation. I imagined her routines, the way she might fold laundry or schedule dinners or make casual plans for a future that was already being hollowed out behind her back, and the unfairness of that settled deeper than anything my wife had done to me, because at least I had the privilege of suspicion, while this woman was still living inside a version of reality that was being quietly undermined by people who benefited from her ignorance. The attraction I felt toward her startled me, not because it was romantic or sexual in any obvious way, but because it was rooted in recognition, in the sense that she and I were already connected by something intimate and unchosen, and that awareness carried a charge that made my skin prickle when I looked at her photos or read her words, because there's a particular kind of tension that comes from knowing you share a truth with someone who doesn't yet know it exists. I caught myself wondering what her voice sounded like, how she carried herself in person, whether she would see through people as quickly as I suspected she could. And every time that thought surfaced, I reminded myself that this wasn't about replacing one intimacy with another. It was about understanding the full scope of the lie I was standing in, mapping its edges so I could decide where to press. I didn't tell my wife I knew his name, and I didn't let my behavior change in any way she could measure, because predictability had become my camouflage, and as she went on laughing at her phone and drifting through our shared spaces with that careful distance she thought I couldn't feel, I sat with the knowledge that there was another woman moving through her days with no idea that her marriage, my marriage, and one man's polished public image were all braided together in a way that was about to matter. I wasn't angry in the way I expected to be, not yet, because anger requires a release, and what I felt instead was a tightening focus, a quiet resolve that began the moment I understood this story wasn't just about me being betrayed, but about deciding whether I would let the rest of it unfold without my consent as well. I didn't stumble into her by fate or coincidence, no matter how much I later let it look that way, because by then I understood that chance favors the person willing to wait and nudge. And I'd learned enough about her routines from public traces to know where she'd be on Thursday afternoons when she carved out time for herself, the kind of time people protect fiercely because it's the only thing that still feels entirely theirs. I arrived early and sat with a coffee I didn't want, watching the door with the calm patience of someone who had already crossed the point of return, telling myself that if she didn't show, I would walk away and rethink everything, except some deeper part of me already knew she would. because people who believe their lives are stable don't imagine they need to hide. When she walked in, it was like seeing her step out of a photograph and into something that breathed, her presence immediately grounding the room without demanding attention. And I remember thinking how unfair it was that the person being deceived carried herself with such unforced confidence, like someone who'd never been asked to doubt the floor beneath her. I waited until she ordered before moving, letting the line close the distance naturally, and when I spoke, it was with the practiced ease of a stranger asking for something ordinary, my voice steady enough that even I believed it, and she turned toward me with a polite smile that sharpened into interest when she realized I wasn't flustered or rehearsed, just attentive. We exchanged names like people do every day without consequence, except my chest tightened when she said hers, because hearing it aloud collapsed the distance I'd been holding on to, and suddenly she wasn't an abstract victim or a symbol in a plan. She was a woman standing close enough that I could smell her perfume, subtle and deliberate, nothing like the louder, sweeter scent my wife wore when she came home flushed with secrets. Our conversation slid into something easy, not because I steered it there, but because she met me halfway with a curiosity that felt mutual rather than cautious, and I could tell she was used to people performing around her, used to being talked at instead of with, which made her attentiveness feel like an invitation rather than a test. What surprised me was how quickly she began to ask questions that mattered, not prying ones, but the kind that suggest a person is listening for shape rather than facts. And when she said, "You seem like someone who notices things most people overlook, and that usually means you're carrying more than you let on," I felt a flash of heat that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with recognition, because it was the first time in months someone had looked at me and seen something other than convenience. I answered carefully, choosing truth without context, telling her that I believed people reveal themselves whether they mean to or not, and she laughed softly, the sound low and genuine, as she replied, "That's either very cynical or very hopeful, and I can't tell which yet." And the word yet hung between us with a possibility that made my pulse quicken. I watched her closely as we talked, cataloging the small tells the way I'd learned to do at home, except hers didn't signal deception. They signaled awareness, the way her eyes held contact without aggression, the way she paused before answering difficult questions, the way she adjusted her posture when something genuinely interested her instead of when she felt threatened. And the more I observed, the clearer it became that she wasn't blind or naive. She was simply trusting in a world that had given her every reason to believe trust was safe. When our conversation drifted toward relationships in that casual, hypothetical way people use to test boundaries without admitting it, she said, "I think loyalty is something you don't notice until it's missing, because when it's there, it just feels like air." And the honesty in her voice hit me so hard I had to look away for a moment, because it confirmed what I'd suspected all along, which was that the wrong people were bearing the cost of someone else's choices. By the time we stood to leave, there was a hum between us that wasn't flirtation exactly, but something adjacent to it, a tension born of shared intelligence and unspoken understanding. And when she said, with a half-smile that dared me to disappoint her, "It was unexpectedly refreshing to talk to someone who doesn't rush to fill silence with noise," I knew that whatever I was doing had already crossed from observation into involvement. We exchanged a polite goodbye that felt anything but casual, and as I watched her walk away with the same composed confidence she'd entered with, I felt the first real shift in power since this began, because for the first time I wasn't alone in knowing that something beneath the surface deserved to be examined, and she had no idea yet how close she was to the truth, or how deliberately I'd placed myself in her path. The kiss didn't happen the way people imagine when they think of betrayal or desire, because there was no sudden pull or reckless heat, only a deliberate narrowing of the world as we stood outside the gallery opening she'd invited me to, after weeks of carefully neutral conversations that had grown charged without either of us naming it, the night air cool against my face, the low murmur of people spilling onto the sidewalk around us, and her standing closer than necessary as she spoke about the exhibit, with an intensity that told me she knew exactly how much she was revealing without ever saying the word why. She paused mid-thought and looked at me with an expression that felt like a question she was tired of asking herself in private, And when she said, in a voice that carried both composure and challenge, "You keep showing up in my life in ways that feel intentional, and I'm trying to decide whether that makes me uneasy or curious," I felt the weight of everything unsaid press between us, because that was the moment I understood she wasn't unaware of the tension. She was choosing to stand inside it. I answered honestly but incompletely, telling her, "I don't believe in accidents when people keep finding each other, and I think curiosity is what happens when your instincts recognize something before your mind catches up." And she held my gaze long enough that the sounds around us softened into background noise, her breath shallow, her lips parted as if she were about to respond, and instead, I stepped forward just enough to cross the invisible line we'd both been pretending wasn't there. I kissed her slowly, deliberately, in full view of a street that would remember it without understanding it, my hand light at her waist, her body stiffening for a heartbeat before she leaned in with a quiet resolve that told me she wasn't confused about what this meant, and the contact itself was restrained, almost restrained to the point of cruelty, because it wasn't about hunger or romance, it was about declaration, about changing the terms of a story that had been written without either of our consent. When we pulled apart, she didn't step back or look away, and her voice was steady when she said, "That was either a mistake you'll regret or a message you meant very carefully, and I need to know which one before I decide how I feel about it." And I answered her with the kind of truth that lands heavier than confession, telling her, "I don't do impulsive things, and I don't touch people unless I understand the consequences. So if you felt something shift just now, that wasn't an accident, and it wasn't meant to be gentle." She studied me for a long moment, searching my face for something she could dismiss, and whatever she found there made her nod slowly as she replied, "Then you should know that I don't scare easily and I don't play games I don't understand. So if you crossed that line to wake me up, it worked." The air between us felt electric, not with promise but with recognition, and as we stood there surrounded by strangers who would forget us by morning, I knew that the kiss had done exactly what I needed it to do, because it fractured the quiet agreement everyone else was relying on. It introduced ambiguity where certainty had been abused, and it ensured that whatever came next would not belong solely to the people who thought they could keep living their double lives untouched. The aftermath didn't announce itself with accusations or scenes, and that was what made it so unsettling, because the world kept moving while something underneath it shifted, subtle and deliberate, like pressure redistributing before a fracture, and I could feel it most clearly at home where my wife's certainty began to fray in ways she couldn't name. She started watching me instead of assuming me, her questions gaining an edge that tried to pass as casual curiosity, asking where I'd been with a brightness that arrived half a second too late, asking who I was texting with a laugh that didn't quite land, and I answered her the way she'd been answering me for months, with truth stripped of context and reassurance offered just generously enough to keep her steady. The irony wasn't lost on me when she said one evening, standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed loosely like she was trying not to look defensive, "You've seemed distant lately, and I can't tell if I'm imagining it or if something's going on with you." And I felt a sharp, almost intoxicating calm as I replied, "Nothing's going on, and I think we're just both tired, but I'm right here," watching her nod slowly as if the words should settle her, even though they didn't. Outside our house, the ripples widened quietly, because the man she was risking everything for started losing his balance in small, visible ways, canceling plans at the last minute, checking his phone too often in meetings, growing curt where he'd once been smooth, and I didn't need updates to sense it, because my wife brought the tension home with her whether she meant to or not. She snapped at minor inconveniences, flinched when notifications buzzed, and lay awake beside me scrolling long after she thought I'd fallen asleep, her body rigid with a vigilance that told me she felt something slipping but couldn't identify what, and when I rolled toward her one night and brushed my hand against her back, she startled so hard it broke whatever illusion of control she'd been clinging to. She apologized too quickly, saying she was just on edge because work was stressful, and I murmured something sympathetic into the darkness, because the truth was that I needed her nervous. I needed her distracted. I needed her focused on stabilizing her secret instead of protecting it. The most telling moments were the ones she didn't realize were confessions, like when she said over dinner, pushing food around her plate without eating, "It feels like everyone's acting strange lately, like there's some conversation happening I'm not part of." And I met her gaze evenly as I answered, "Maybe people are just getting tired of pretending things are fine when they aren't," watching her swallow hard as if the words had grazed something tender. She began reaching for me more often, touches lingering a second longer than necessary, kisses carrying a question she didn't dare ask outright, and the attraction between us surged in complicated, uncomfortable ways, because there's a particular intensity that comes from wanting reassurance from the person you're betraying, a desire to reclaim what you're in the process of undermining. I didn't pull away, and I didn't lean in. I simply matched her energy without giving her clarity, letting the ambiguity do its work, because clarity would have been mercy, and mercy wasn't part of this anymore. Meanwhile, the woman I'd kissed moved through my thoughts with a quiet steadiness that felt nothing like infatuation, more like alignment, and though we didn't speak about the kiss directly, its presence shaped every interaction that followed, her messages measured but unmistakably aware, her tone sharpened by a curiosity that had turned active. When she said, during one of our conversations that danced carefully around the truth, "I've started noticing inconsistencies I used to overlook, and I can't tell if I'm more angry at the deception or at myself for accepting it," I knew the fracture had reached its next stage, because awareness changes everything even before action does. By the end of that week, my wife was no longer relaxed in her deception, and the man she trusted to be discreet was unraveling under scrutiny he couldn't place, and neither of them knew why, only that the world they'd constructed on assumptions was suddenly unstable. I moved through it all with a calm that felt almost foreign, answering questions without volunteering explanations, offering affection without surrendering certainty, and as I watched them strain to regain control over something they didn't realize had already slipped beyond them, I understood that the most effective revenge doesn't announce itself. It simply changes the rules and lets everyone else discover too late that they no longer know how to play. I found out she knew in a way that felt almost merciful compared to everything else, because there was no drama in the revelation, no confrontation or raised voice, just a quiet moment that recontextualized every interaction we'd had and made me realize how arrogant it was to assume I was the only one paying attention. We were sitting across from each other in the same cafe where we'd first met, the late afternoon light slanting across the table in a way that softened everything it touched, and she was stirring her drink slowly, not because it needed it, but because she was choosing her timing. She looked up at me with that same steady gaze I'd come to recognize as her default state, and said, without hesitation or preamble, "I need you to understand something before this goes any further, because I don't like operating on false assumptions, and I don't want you thinking you woke me up." And the words landed with a strange gentleness that made my stomach tighten. I didn't interrupt her, because I could already sense the shape of what was coming, and she continued, her voice calm and precise, telling me that she'd known about his affair for years, not in the vague, denial-soaked way people joke about, but concretely, painfully, with dates and patterns and proof she hadn't gone looking for but hadn't ignored either. She explained it the way someone explains a long illness, describing the initial shock, the period of self-blame, the quiet investigations conducted at night when the house was still, and the eventual clarity that came with accepting that the truth existed whether she acted on it or not. And as she spoke, I felt something shift from beneath me, because the power dynamic I thought I'd been manipulating dissolved into something far more complex. She told me she stayed not because she was weak or afraid, but because leaving without leverage would have cost her things she wasn't willing to lose, and she had learned early on that patience could be a form of control when used deliberately. When she said, "I document patterns the way some people journal feelings because facts don't gaslight you later," I understood that the kiss I thought had fractured her reality had actually served a different purpose entirely, one I hadn't anticipated. She met my eyes and said, "What you did wasn't reckless, and it wasn't meaningless, but it also wasn't the beginning of my awareness. It was the confirmation I needed that the affair had crossed from something private and survivable into something public and humiliating. And there was no accusation in her tone, only a clear statement of cause and effect. She explained that public ambiguity mattered, that reputation thrived on plausibility, and that the kiss had introduced uncertainty he couldn't control or explain away, especially not when paired with the other inconsistencies she'd been quietly cataloging. As she spoke, I felt a mix of admiration and something closer to awe, because the woman I'd half imagined as a potential ally or collateral damage revealed herself as the most deliberate person in this entire situation, someone who had been waiting not for truth, but for timing. When she finished, the silence between us felt different than it ever had, stripped of tension and replaced with clarity, and I realized that my role in this story had never been to rescue or awaken her, but to unknowingly provide a variable she could use, a disruption that made denial impossible. She watched my reaction closely and said, almost kindly, "If this makes you uncomfortable, I understand, because people don't like discovering they weren't the smartest one in the room." And I surprised myself by laughing quietly, not out of embarrassment but relief, because there was something deeply grounding about finally knowing the full scope of the board. I told her honestly that it didn't make me uncomfortable at all, that it made me feel less alone, and she nodded once, as if that answer confirmed something she'd already suspected. As we stood to leave, she said, "Now that you know I'm not fragile, we can decide what happens next with eyes open." And I walked out into the fading light, understanding that the kiss hadn't been the spark I thought it was, but it had still mattered, because it marked the moment two people who refused to be reduced to collateral finally recognized each other for what they were. Once the illusion of discovery was gone, what remained between us was something far more precise, a shared understanding that neither of us needed validation or rescue, only alignment, and that made our conversations sharper, stripped of posturing, focused entirely on outcomes. We didn't meet secretly after that, because secrecy was no longer the point, and instead we chose neutral spaces where intention could hide in plain sight, sitting across from each other like colleagues discussing logistics rather than two people quietly coordinating the collapse of carefully maintained lies. She spoke in timelines and contingencies, in parallel moves and pressure points, and I listened with an attention that surprised me, because for the first time since this began, I wasn't improvising from pain. I was contributing to something structured, something that didn't rely on emotional explosions or dramatic reveals. When she said calmly, "The mistake most people make is thinking consequences need to be loud to be effective. But what actually dismantles someone is when everything they rely on shifts at once and they can't tell which thread to grab." I felt a grim satisfaction settle into place, because it echoed exactly what I'd been circling without language. We compared notes without sharing documents, because trust didn't need proof between us, just consistency, and it became clear how carefully she'd mapped her husband's patterns, how she understood the rhythms of his confidence and his fear, the times he was most vulnerable to scrutiny, and the moments he believed himself untouchable. I offered what I knew about my wife, the financial assumptions she made, the narratives she repeated when she wanted to feel in control, the way she underestimated silence and mistook calm for compliance, and as we talked, I realized how similar our situations were despite the differences, because both of them had built their affairs on the same fragile belief that the people closest to them were either too trusting or too predictable to ever disrupt the balance. When I asked her, not casually, "What does the end look like for you?" she didn't hesitate before answering, telling me that she didn't want spectacle or sympathy. She wanted leverage to land cleanly, professionally, publicly enough that no one could reframe her as emotional or reactive, and I told her that I wanted the same, not vengeance for its own sake, but a recalibration that left no room for them to pretend this had been mutual or misunderstood. We planned around timing rather than tactics, agreeing that the impact would come from simultaneity, from letting revelations arrive from different directions at once, so neither of them could coordinate a response or rewrite the story before it spread. And there was a strange intimacy in that process, not sexual or romantic, but rooted in competence and mutual respect. Occasionally the tension flared anyway, in glances held a second too long or pauses that carried more weight than necessary, and when it did, she acknowledged it without embarrassment, once saying quietly, I won't pretend there isn't chemistry here, but clarity matters more to me than comfort, and I won't confuse the two. And I respected her more for it than if she'd denied it outright. I told her honestly that whatever attraction existed was secondary to the alignment, that what drew me to her now wasn't the kiss or the thrill, but the steadiness with which she moved through this without flinching. And she smiled at that, not warmly, but with approval. At home, my wife grew increasingly restless as the date we'd chosen approached, sensing movement without being able to locate its source, and she oscillated between clinging and detachment, between sudden affection and brittle irritation, and each shift confirmed how deeply she relied on control to feel safe. When she said one night, her voice tight as she traced patterns on my arm, "I feel like you're planning something and not telling me, and I don't know why that scares me so much," I answered her with the same measured honesty she'd given me for months, telling her that sometimes people sense change because it's already happening whether they acknowledge it or not, and watching her swallow that answer because she had no grounds to challenge it. As the pieces slid into place, there was no gloating or celebration between the woman and me, only a shared quiet that felt earned, because we both understood that what we were about to do would close doors permanently, and that kind of finality deserves respect. On the last day before everything shifted, she looked at me across the table and said, "Whatever happens next, I want you to know that I don't see you as collateral or a tool, and I never did." And I replied without hesitation that I felt the same, that whatever else this had been, it had restored something in me I thought I'd lost, which was the ability to act deliberately rather than reactively. We stood and parted without ceremony, because the work was done, and as I walked away, I felt a calm settle over me that had nothing to do with forgiveness or closure, and everything to do with knowing that for the first time since this began, the timing belonged to us. I thought I understood the shape of her betrayal until the night I overheard her on the phone in the hallway, her voice low and controlled in a way that snapped something into focus so cleanly it almost felt like relief, because what she was saying wasn't romantic or reckless or even emotional, it was logistical. She spoke about timelines and contingencies, about making sure everything is settled before I make any moves, about how he won't see it coming because he thinks I'm still undecided. And I stood there in the dark with my hand braced against the wall, realizing that the affair hadn't been her escape from me at all. It had been her insurance policy. In that moment, every odd behavior rearranged itself into a clearer pattern. The way she'd been quietly asking about accounts and investments she'd previously ignored. The way she'd floated hypotheticals about separation with a false casualness. The way she'd encouraged me to take on more responsibilities while she positioned herself as uncertain and fragile. And I understood that the man she was sleeping with was never meant to replace me emotionally. He was meant to cushion her landing while she extracted herself cleanly and left me holding the confusion. The betrayal deepened not because of the sex or the lies, but because of the calculation. Because she hadn't just stepped outside our marriage, she'd been managing me like a variable, relying on my predictability to keep her plans intact, and that realization stripped away the last impulse toward confrontation. I didn't interrupt her call, and I didn't expose myself by reacting, because the calm that settled over me then was different from anything I'd felt before, sharper and more decisive, and I recognized it as clarity. She ended the call and returned to the living room with that familiar mask of concern, asking if everything was okay because I looked tired, and I answered honestly in the narrowest sense, telling her I'd just had a long day and needed some air, watching the flicker of relief cross her face as she nodded, satisfied that the man she thought she was managing remained intact. What she didn't know was that her timing had already failed her, because the assumptions she'd built her plan on depended entirely on my ignorance, on the idea that I would react emotionally when cornered, that I would argue or plead or demand explanations, and instead I adjusted quietly, making small, precise changes that protected what mattered without alerting her to the shift. I listened more than I spoke, documented without dramatizing, and let her believe her performance was still working even as the ground beneath it changed, and there was a bitter irony in watching her grow more confident as her exit strategy matured, not realizing that the man she trusted to keep her secret had already lost control of his own narrative elsewhere. The final confirmation came when she tried to bait me into a fight, pressing just hard enough to provoke the kind of reaction she could later point to as justification, accusing me of being emotionally unavailable, of making her feel alone, of forcing her to look elsewhere for support. And I responded with an evenness that threw her completely off balance, telling her that if she felt alone, it was worth examining why. Because loneliness doesn't come from neglect alone, it comes from division. She stared at me as if I'd spoken a language she didn't understand, because in her mind I was supposed to either break or beg, and instead I'd simply observed, and that was when I knew her real game was already lost. As I watched her retreat into herself that night, frustration simmering where certainty used to live, I felt no rush of victory, only a steady resolve, because understanding her strategy didn't make me angrier. It made me precise. Whatever she thought she was securing for herself had been built on the assumption that I would remain predictable until the end. And as I lay awake beside her, listening to her breathe with the same controlled calm she used on the phone, I knew that the most consequential mistake she'd made wasn't cheating on me. It was underestimating how quietly I could step out of the role she'd assigned me without announcing it at all. The end didn't arrive with raised voices or slammed doors, and it didn't need witnesses to feel real, because by the time everything surfaced, the work had already been done quietly, methodically, and in ways that couldn't be undone by rewriting the story. The consequences landed the way we'd intended, not as a single explosion but as a convergence, her husband confronted with documentation he couldn't dismiss. At the same time, his professional reputation began to strain under questions he couldn't answer cleanly. My wife discovering that the leverage she thought she was securing had evaporated because the assumptions beneath it no longer held. She came home that evening pale and tightly controlled, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with her hands folded like she was bracing for impact, and she said carefully, "We need to talk about some things that have come up, and I think we've both been avoiding realities for a while." And I listened without interrupting, because for the first time she wasn't performing confidence. She was reacting to a world that had moved without her permission. When she finished outlining her version of events, the softened narrative where intentions were blurred and responsibility diluted, I answered her calmly, telling her that I was aware of far more than she realized, that the timing of her plans was no longer hers to manage, and that whatever she thought she was negotiating had already been recalibrated. She stared at me with a mixture of disbelief and something like fear, asking how long I'd known, and I told her the truth without drama, that knowing wasn't the point, deciding was, and that I'd already made my decisions while she was still assuming I would wait for her to explain herself. There were no apologies that mattered after that, because apologies offered under pressure are just another tactic, and I didn't need closure from her to feel complete. The separation unfolded with an efficiency that surprised her, assets protected, narratives contained, exits managed without spectacle, and she kept searching my face for anger she could use to reframe herself as the wounded party, only to find none she could hold on to. Across town, another marriage was ending with similar quiet finality, not because of the kiss itself, but because the kiss had made denial untenable. And when I spoke with the woman one last time, there was no lingering tension or regret between us, only a shared understanding that what we'd done had restored balance rather than destroyed it. She told me, with that same steady clarity, this wasn't about punishment, it was about ending something that was feeding on silence. And I agreed, because that was the truest description of what had happened. In the weeks that followed, life didn't suddenly become perfect or easy, but it became honest in a way it hadn't been for a long time, and that honesty felt like relief rather than loss. I moved through my days without the constant low-grade vigilance of being lied to, without the sense that my reality was provisional, and sometimes I thought about the kiss, not with longing, but as a marker, the moment I stopped waiting for permission to act inside my own life. Revenge, I learned, doesn't always look like triumph, and it doesn't always feel loud or righteous. Sometimes it looks like walking away intact, while the people who underestimated you are left trying to explain how everything slipped out of their control. I didn't chase validation or make public statements or demand acknowledgement, because the satisfaction came from knowing that I hadn't been reduced to a passive character in someone else's plan, and as I stood alone in a quiet apartment that felt empty but unburdened, I understood that the most lasting victory wasn't making them hurt. It was reclaiming my agency so completely that their choices no longer defined the shape of my future.